Hey everyone, we're back immediately after finishing Chapter 8 to talk about some of the big ideas here from Chapter 9. And maybe the last one was a little bit long, so for this one I'm going to try to focus on the really big important things. If you have any questions, obviously please feel free to email me, or if you have any, just comments or anything, I will be here. Chapter 9 immediately reminds us, with the first three words, that Nick is looking back at this. We are 2 years after this has happened. So Nick is seemingly writing this in 1924, looking back 2 years before to what happened. And he talks about the public response here. Catherine denies any sort of affair from her sister Myrtle. And so it's just sort of talked about as a madman deranged by grief. One quote that I might highlight here is Nick mentions, I found myself on Gatsby's side and alone. He immediately reaches out here to try to get help from other people who were close to Gatsby, people that Nick feels like they should know that Gatsby has died, that they would want to be there. He calls up Daisy almost immediately. And again, he says called her instinctively and without hesitation, but he finds out she and Tom had gone away early that afternoon and taken baggage with them without leaving any kind of address or saying when they'd be back. He tries to call Meyer Wolfsheim 3 times and nobody answers. And one thing that can be very confusing for students is that here Nick is sort of imagining Gatsby talking to him, especially, that's why I like to be very emphatic at the end of Chapter 8 that Gatsby was killed, because here Nick is imagining Gatsby talking to him, saying, "Look here, old sport, you've got to get somebody for me." Nick feels responsible. He's the one that everyone is going to, that's seemingly the only friend that Gatsby has here. And Nick sends a letter to Wolfsheim, and he gets this response, down, as we see down the bottom of this page, of Wolfsheim is shocked, but he can't come down now. He's tied up in some very important business. Let me know about the funeral, etc. He gets a call from someone named Slagle, who immediately hangs up, presumably some of Gatsby's shady business. It isn't until 3 days later here that he gets a telegram from a Henry Gatz, who's currently in Minnesota. And here we see Gatsby's father make an appearance. A solemn old man, very helpless and dismayed, bundled up in a long, cheap ulster against the warm September day. And Gatsby's father gives a very different impression. And, he calls him Jimmy, which is like, for Jay Gatsby, the one that we've come to know over the last 8 chapters, Jimmy, knowing him as James Gatz, obviously is a different perspective here. Nick calls him Mr. Gatsby. Here, Nick mentions, we were close friends. And we have an interesting hypothetical here from Henry Gatz. If he'd have lived, and this might be a quote to get down, says Gatsby's father, he'd have been a great man, a man like James J. Hill. He'd have helped build up the country. And the reference to James J. Hill there, someone we don't really know well today, is not the most important thing. The most important thing here, I think, is this question of what could Gatsby have done if he had lived? And by lived, I don't mean like if he had just survived this attack, but if he had lived differently. What can Gatsby do if he moves on from Daisy in a healthy way, instead of this dream, this obsession. But we can talk about that as we move through the chapter here. Klipspringer calls up. Remember Klipspringer? He was the one who played the piano back in chapter 5. He's someone who came to Gatsby's party and basically stayed so long that he was essentially living there. And Klipspringer, when Nick tells him about the funeral, sort of indignantly saying, like, how about saying you'll come to the funeral? Klipspringer mentions, well, there's sort of a picnic or something. And what Klipspringer was calling about was tennis shoes. I'm sort of helpless without them. And Nick just hangs up. Nick says, after that, I felt a certain shame for Gatsby. One gentleman to whom I telephoned implied that he got what he deserved. And so Nick basically, at this point, having found, reaching out to all these people, getting very little response, he basically forces himself in to Meyer Wolfsheim. And I would also point out again, being written in published in 1925, swastika, very, very, very different in terms of symbolism compared to what we see happen 5, 10, 15 years later in Germany. And so the secretary lies about him being there. Nick forces himself in to chat with Meyer Wolfsheim. And Wolfsheim basically talks about him as Gatsby being a partner for business, someone who, because of the racism and the anti-Semitism of the time, Wolfsheim can't do business with everyone. But someone like Gatsby can represent him better as a partner. And he mentions, we were so thick like that and everything, always together, that they became partners. And Wolfsheim, even with his eyes filling with tears, says he won't go to the funeral. How does he justify it? He says, let us learn to show our friendship for a man when he is alive and not after he is dead. And so Nick returns to Henry Gatz. We see this old adventure book, a Hopalong Cassidy book, and here we see a schedule. And this is the earliest thing we see from Gatsby at all. This is not even from Gatsby, this is from James Gatz. And so written in this book is a schedule. Rise from bed, all these different things. Study electricity, which at the time was one of the newest inventions. Today that would be something like coding or app development. Practice elocution, how to speak well. Poise and how to attain it. Study needed inventions. His resolves. And what we see emerging from this list, and you might recognize a sort of parallel here. I'm not saying it's a direct intentional reference, but if this seems familiar at all to Benjamin Franklin's schedule, that idea of an industrious person making something of themselves, because that's what America offers you. I think that's a good connection to make. And we see, even at a very young age, the determination of James Gatz to better himself, to the ambition of the young man. And as we then see his funeral, we have Nick waiting and for someone else to join them at the house for the funeral procession, and nobody came. Who is there at the actual burial? Nick, Gatsby's father, the minister, and then one other person. Owl Eyes from chapter 4. And as we see Owl Eyes here, I might ask you, what do these, the minister has to be there. He's being paid to be there. There's really 3 people who choose to come to Gatsby's funeral. And we can obviously appreciate the contrast with, remember back at the start of chapter, I want to say it's chapter 4, the list of all the dozens of people that came to the party. And I told you don't need to remember the individual names, but just pages and pages of people who came to his parties. The difference between all those hundreds, if not thousands of people, and here, Owl Eyes, Gatsby, and then Gatsby's father. What do those 3 people have in common? What I might throw out to you is that they are the only people who looked beneath the surface with Gatsby. The only people who opened up the book to see if it was real, so to speak. And then as Owl Eyes poetically says down the bottom of this page, why, my God, they used to go there by the hundreds. He took off his glasses, wiped them again, outside and in. The poor son of a bitch, he said. The contrast there between the crowd in chapter 3 for the party and then the crowd here for Gatsby's funeral. And here Nick is going to reflect. This is the end of the book, and it's the end of the story for Nick as well. As he's thinking about returning to the Midwest. Because we know from chapter 1 that he goes back to the Midwest. And Nick has to leave. After Gatsby's death, says Nick, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. And before he leaves, Nick says, there was one thing that had to be done before I left, an awkward, unpleasant thing that perhaps had better have been let alone, but I wanted to leave things in order. Is really Nick breaking up here, or finalizing the breakup with Jordan to say goodbye. She mentions that, she's engaged. Nick's not sure whether to believe her or not. And the only thing I might point out here is that Nick is changed by what has happened in this book, because we have a pattern of Nick of, he was rumored to be with that girl back in the Midwest, and he just kind of ghosted her and went to New York City. And then he was dating that girl from Jersey City, he mentions, back in chapter 3. And when her brother starts throwing mean looks at Nick, he just stops talking to her too. Nick has the chance here to do the same thing to Jordan, to just sort of peace out and never talk to her again. But he chooses the harder way. And so one of the things that I might question as we get to the end of the book here is, how has Nick changed? How has Nick changed? A lot of characters don't seem to have changed at all. Does Nick? And if so, how? Here we have one answer. I'm 30, I said. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor. Nick perhaps becoming more disillusioned, to use one of our characteristics of modernism, but maybe also more honest with himself. And then we have two more meetings here. One is with Tom Buchanan, who stretches out his hand to shake hands with Nick, and Nick will not shake hands with him. Why? Because Nick is practicing social distancing for the coronavirus. No, he's not. He's angry with Tom. He is correct in wondering, what did you say to Wilson that afternoon? Nick looks at the situation, and he knows he guessed right. Who's the one who took Wilson and pointed him at Gatsby? In Nick's mind, it's Tom. And Tom admits it here. Tom feels justified. Wilson came to talk to me. Wilson had a gun. And, oh, by the way, says Tom, Gatsby ran over Myrtle like a dog. never even stopped his car. And this is another great example of dramatic irony, because we as readers know that it was Daisy who was driving, who didn't stop the car. And so for Nick, he said he couldn't forgive him or like him, but Nick sees that it was to him entirely justified. And we have an important quote here. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess that they had made. Tom and Daisy just kind of keep on dancing through their life here. They didn't necessarily get negatively impacted by this. And we're done with Tom. But before we end the book, we hit our last scene here. Excuse me. The last night that Nick is in New York. And here's the goodbye. This is our last 2 pages of the book, so I'm almost done. I have no idea how long this is. I'm sorry if it's like an hour and a half. But so Nick mentions here his final goodbye. And where does he choose to end the book? We talked about that idea with Of Mice and Men. Where does the author choose to end the book? Here, Nick chooses to end at Gatsby's house. And he mentions that as he goes over to Gatsby's house, there is, on the white steps, an obscene word scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick. And Nick chooses to erase it. And what I might throw out to you there is that I think that is a symbolic act. Someone has written an obscenity on Gatsby's steps, and Nick chooses to remove it. And what I would argue there is that maybe that is what Nick is trying to do with Gatsby as a whole, to share that the world has judged Gatsby as obscene. And what Nick is trying to do by sharing this book is to erase that, to show a different side of Gatsby, a side that is perhaps not just the obscene. And Nick walks down to the beach, and this is the first, the one we're reminded of the first time we ever see Gatsby stretching his arms out toward that green light. And as we get in the very ending here, we have another comparison with green. Nick mentions, I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Here, what Nick is doing, as we see Gatsby reaching out for the green light, and Nick also makes the comparison here with this green new world of America, is directly commenting on what we talked about before, which is the American dream. I would argue that Gatsby is the human personification of the American dream. Someone who can make anything of themselves, who has the opportunity and the freedom to create whoever they want to be. But we might see some commentary on Fitzgerald's part here. That person is corrupted by, or at least somewhat corrupted, by the pursuit of wealth. Remember, we see this friction that Fitzgerald had mentioned before about Gatsby's corruption, but his incorruptible dream. And then the last few lines, very famous. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And that last line is a very famous one here, because this is a book about people who are trapped in the past. Who could we take a minute? You can pause if you need to. Who do we see who's stuck in the past in this book? Tom. His past as a football player, chasing that excitement. We might see Daisy as being stuck in her past as a reason why she isn't willing to go with Gatsby. But most importantly, of course, we could say Gatsby is a man who's stuck in his past. When you have something horrible happen to you, how are we going to deal with it? Will we be obsessed with trying to repeat it, to fix it, and maybe lose ourselves in the process? Or do we try to move on? But who else is stuck in the past in this book? Who else is writing about the death of his friend 2 years after it happened? Is Nick, when he says here, born back ceaselessly into the past, talking about himself here as well? A man who went east to go discover a new life for himself, and instead found himself, I don't know if scarred, scarred by what he found there. And way back in chapter 1, interesting to read now that we're done. Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Just some rambling thoughts on some big ideas there. If there's anything I said that's confusing, obviously reach out. But I hope you enjoyed the book. It's a good one. There's a lot of beautiful writing and a lot of big ideas to discuss here as well. I'm going to end this before it becomes 75 minutes long. Take care, everybody.